from the UK in a town called Blackpool. If you have a question, like me, for crowd science, then please do feel free to email in to crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. The programme was presented by Caroline Steele and produced by Emily Bird. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, discussing another best-selling novel.
The Weekend is by the award-winning Australian author Charlotte Wood.
Often the portrayal of older women in popular culture is that they are mothers, grandmothers, possibly aunts, but often they're defined in relationship to their children. And I wanted to sort of write against that.
World Book Club, Saturday at 11 GMT. At bbcworldservice.com, the climate question.
The Great Migration of Wildebeest in the Serengeti is one of the wonders of the natural world. We'll hear how climate change is altering this epic journey, affecting not just the animals, but our fight against global warming itself.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to The History Hour with me, Max Pearson, the past brought to life by those who were there. This week, 30 years on, the horrors of the Rwandan genocide remembered.
I didn't hear the news, my dad had the news, and he said, this is the apocalypse, this is the end, the Hutus are going to kill us.
We'll also be looking at the history of NATO, plus the flooding of a valley in Pakistan that caused a wave of migration to Britain.
We're still connected to that land deeply. I still dream of that land. It feels like I'm wandering those houses, those streets.
Also, the opening of Britain's first nudist beach, and Dr. Heimlich of the Heimlich manoeuvre as seen by his daughter.
This procedure was so simple that he started to hear about cases where very young children would save their very young siblings or save a parent.
That's after we get a bulletin of the latest world news.
Hello, I'm Emily Thomas with the BBC News. Israeli forces have pulled out of Gaza's biggest hospital, Al-Shifa, after a 2-week operation, leaving behind a scene of widespread destruction. The Israeli military says it killed around 200 militants and detained about 900 suspects. From Jerusalem, here's Yolande now.
After 2 weeks of intense gun battles and Israeli airstrikes, Palestinian witnesses say that Israeli tanks and armoured vehicles streamed out of Gaza City's large medical complex in the darkness. The Hamas-run health ministry says they left behind dozens of bodies, while locals say nearby residential areas have been razed. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said a Shifa hospital had become a terrorist lair and that Israeli forces surprised Hamas with precise and surgical action there.
Israeli police have arrested a sister of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. A police statement said a 57-year-old woman had been detained on suspicion of having links with the militant group. She's a resident of the southern Israeli town of Tel Sheva. The woman will appear in court later on Monday. Hundreds of Israeli protesters have spent the night in tents outside Parliament in Jerusalem to press their demand for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to step down. They accuse him of mishandling the response to the Hamas attacks of nearly 6 months ago. He argues that holding elections now would paralyse Israel for months. On Sunday, tens of thousands of demonstrators took part in what they said was the biggest anti-government demonstration since the war in the Gaza Strip began. Labour Party MP Gilad Kariv joined the protest.
This rally shows that the Israeli public woke up. It is clear today, 6 months after the massacre of October 7th, that in order to win, we need new leadership. In order to bring back the hostages, we need new leadership.
The main opposition party in Turkey says Sunday's local elections were not free or fair, despite winning its largest victory in almost half a century. The CHP's Secretary-General, Selin Sayek-Burka, said her colleagues were only given a few seconds on the national broadcaster, compared with the hours taken up by the governing AK party. The CHP won all 5 of the largest urban centres. William Armstrong is in Istanbul.
This has been a really strong result for the main opposition party, the CHP. That was really unexpected, actually. There were a lot of predictions before the election that with fragmentation in the opposition, they would really struggle to even measure up to the previous performance in 2019 local elections, but they actually surpassed it very much. And there are a number of factors at play there. A lot of people have pointed to the economy. Turkey headed to these elections with inflation at 67%. The interest rates are at 50% at the moment. And that's caused a lot of disillusionment in government voters.
William Armstrong reporting. You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Germany has legalised cannabis as the government tries to tackle the black market trade in the drug. Those aged 18 and over can now carry 25 grams for personal use. They can also grow 3 marijuana plants at home. But smoking cannabis within 100 metres of schools or sports centres remains illegal. Official figures from China suggest the world's second largest economy is showing tentative signs of recovery. The National Statistics Bureau says factory output is slightly up for the first time in 6 months. It could be an indication that China's post-pandemic slowdown may be starting to ease, but the growth rate remains low compared with recent years. Police in South Korea are seeking to arrest 2 men for allegedly being part of a plot to install spy cameras in voting booths ahead of this month's parliamentary elections. The men are accused of working with a social media influencer who's already been detained after the discovery of secret recording devices in 40 locations. The authorities say the influencer has far-right political views and wanted to confirm his unsupported accusations of election fraud against the South Korean government. One of Hong Kong's best-known independent bookstores has closed its doors for the last time as freedom of expression in the territory comes under further pressure. Hundreds of well-wishers went to Mount Zero Books on its final day. The owners blamed the closure on a large number of inspections carried out by the authorities in response to anonymous complaints. Margaret Ng, a former pro-democracy politician, says Mount Zero was a symbol of Hong Kong's fearless spirit.
That spirit is unvanquished. It does not disappear. It does not become depressed because of all this. Look at how cheerful people are. They are totally undaunted. In fact, the fact that they have survived this kind of oppressive behavior is something to celebrate.
That was the World News from the BBC.
Hello, this is the History Hour with Max Pearson. This week's witnesses to events from the past who've appeared on the BBC World Service. Coming up, a remarkable story of survival amid the horrors of the Rwandan genocide. How a dam built in Pakistan in the 1960s directly led to a wave of migration. Dr. Heimlich of the Heimlich Manoeuvre fame remembered by his daughter, and the opening of Britain's first nudist beach. But before all that, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed 75 years ago by 12 countries, including the US, UK, Canada and France. Vicky Farncombe has been through the archives to tell the story of how NATO began.
That if the Atlantic Pact is thorough, if it's complete, if it's of a character in which, in the case of aggression, we're all in together, it's the biggest contribution to world peace that any human beings has ever yet devised.
That's Ernest Bevin, Britain's Foreign Secretary from 1945 to 1951, outlining his hopes for a military alliance with Western Europe and the United States. The need for such a coalition was not immediately apparent in the early years following the end of World War II. The former allies of Britain, France, the Soviet Union and the US were determined to find a way to continue the process of cooperation that had begun during the war. They had lots to liaise on, not least the future of defeated Germany. And Ernest Bevin, a socialist who had advanced the trade union movement in Britain, was hopeful of finding common ground with the Russians.
I ask the British people to have patience as we've had to exhibit. We shall reconcile our differences and always remember in this task of making peace, we're not working for a day, but for generations to come.
But as each meeting between the foreign leaders broke down, distrust began to fester. The Soviet Union feared the power of America's atomic bomb, the West the spread of communism. Paul Nitzer was America's Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs at the time. In 1986 he spoke to the BBC.
I think people were concerned at the state of Europe as a result of the war. There was great unemployment, there was inflation, and there was also a great activity by the communists. People were really concerned about the communists taking power, perhaps in France and in Italy, and then later in Germany. And they were even talking about the communists taking power in England at some time.
To help Europe get back on its feet and stave off the lure of communism, economic support from the US came first, in the form of the Marshall Plan. This $13.6 billion aid package was named after George Marshall, the Secretary of State who had first proposed it. But for British politician Bevin, money wasn't enough. He believed the Western European countries also needed the military might of the US to balance the advancing power of the Red Army.
He didn't look like a foreign secretary. He was a squat, rather portly figure, lusty.
This is John J. McCloy, military governor of the American Zone of Germany, describing Bevin in a 1981 BBC documentary.
Bevin always impressed me as a sort of a squat goalie, protecting a goal of British interest, and it was hard to get a puck past him.
In London in 1947, Bevin saw his chance.
To a conference in London came the foreign ministers. On the agreement of the Big Four rested the future of millions. But could men of opposing faiths reach common ground?
The answer was no. The capitalist ministers failed to reach agreements with their communist counterparts.
When that meeting collapsed as a result of Soviet intransigence, Ernest Bevin, British Foreign Secretary, invited American Secretary of State George Marshall privately for dinner in his flat.
This is Theodore Achilles, then a senior official in the State Department, talking to the BBC in 1986.
After dinner, he uttered some historic words. He said, "I am convinced that the Soviet Union will not deal with the West on any reasonable terms in the foreseeable future. That the salvation of the West will depend upon the formation of some form of union in Western Europe, backed by the United States and the Dominions. Some form of moral and material force, which will inspire confidence and energy within and respect elsewhere."
Sir Frank Roberts was Bevin's private secretary at the time.
He wanted the Americans back in Europe because without that, he realized Britain couldn't do it alone, and it was too early. The French were not yet strong in any way, and of course there's no question of German rearmament. And what else was there? Well, I mean, the Dutch and the Belgians weren't going to be much use, and the Italians hadn't yet recovered, so the only thing was to get American troops back into Europe to make the balance with Russian forces on the ground.
The Americans took some persuading. Theodore Achilles again.
We were the reluctant bride. We kept insisting that the Europeans must get together and show what they're prepared to do for themselves and each other, economically and militarily. Then they could come to us and ask what we could do to help.
Two events convinced the US that protecting Western Europe was in their own interest too.
Turbulent days in Czechoslovakia.
In February 1948, a democratically elected coalition government in Czechoslovakia was taken over by its communist members.
Thousands listened intently as Premier Gottwald outlined his government's program and sought to justify the communist seizure of power.
It prompted US President Harry Truman to give a special message to Congress.
Since the close of hostilities, the Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe. It is this ruthless course of action and the clear design to extend it to the remaining free nations of Europe that have brought about the critical situation in Europe today, the tragic death of the Republic of Czechoslovakia.
More hostilities were to come, this time in Germany. In June 1948, the Soviets blockaded all ground routes into the western section of Berlin, which was then controlled by the US, UK and France.
For the Soviets, using all the communist tricks of the trade, were still trying to bring about the downfall of this four-power city of freedom. But Moscow hadn't counted on the determination of the Western Allies, and those allies had proved through their airlift and months of patient negotiation that they wouldn't abandon Berlin.
The blockade was seen in the US as part of an aggressive Soviet master plan, and support in Washington for a military alliance with Western Europe was secured. On April the 4th, 1949, Bevan's vision was realised.
Joining in a united front from the Tropic of Cancer to the North Pole, the Atlantic democracies pledged themselves to a 14-point mutual assistance pact in case of attack on any one of them. To the dramatic ceremonies comes President Truman, who must win Senate ratification for the treaty. In words heard around the world, the President brings home the significance of the historic pact.
It is a simple document, but if it had existed in 1914 and in 1939, supported by the nations who are represented here today, I believe it would have prevented the acts of aggression which led to 2 world wars.
First to sign the treaty, democracy's answer to aggression from any quarter, is Paul-Henri Spaak, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs for Belgium.
Belgium was followed by Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway and Portugal. Then came Bevan's turn.
In the solemnity of this moment, I put my signature to this pact in the name of a people who join with other signatories for the preservation of the great freedom, and in giving an assurance to mankind of our determination to assist all the peoples of the world to live in understanding and good neighborliness.
Throughout the Cold War, NATO forces were not involved in any military engagement. NATO's first use of offensive military action was in 1994 during the Bosnian War. 75 years since its formation, there are now 31 member countries.
Joining us now is Professor Sten Renning, the author of NATO from Cold War to Ukraine, a history of the world's most powerful alliance. So the formation of NATO was clearly a very significant moment in world history, the world dividing into rival blocs. And it has had to change in the face of a changing world. I mean, and presumably a key moment in that aspect would be the collapse of communism at the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, when suddenly the opposition, if you like, the Soviet bloc, crumbled.
The crumbling of the Soviet bloc really raised the question, is the Atlantic peace relevant in today's world? Should we build something entirely new? Should it be a peace that is much wider and built entirely different? One of the key stories at this time involves 2 German personalities, the foreign minister Genscher and his boss, Chancellor Kohl. Where Genscher, he was in favor of a new system, a new order that would involve the Soviet Union at the time and build something different. But Kohl was not on that page. He wanted German unity within the old peace, within the Atlantic peace. There's this fallout, which is very interesting in February of 1990, when it becomes clear to the NATO allies that 2 Germanys, East and West Germany, along with the Soviet Union, the United States, France and Britain, have come together to form a club they call 2+4 that will really run the question of German unity. The Italian and Dutch representatives voiced their concern to Genscher. He puts them down very brutally. He says, are you among the 4 powers responsible for Germany? Are you one of the 2 Germanys? You are neither. And some days later, when Chancellor Kohl meets with President Bush, he's aware of this and he says, I didn't like that, what Genscher did. And he ascribed it all to domestic German politics and said, everyone in Germany is confused but me. And so with these memorable words, Kohl offered Bush a partnership, and they developed that partnership and they made NATO the foundation for the new Europe.
Leaving that aside, NATO as an alliance didn't always function particularly well in the following years. For example, the tensions that emerged over President Bush's so-called war on terror.
President W. Bush takes not only his own country to Afghanistan and then Iraq, but he also takes NATO allies with him. And there's this question, well, what could NATO really do? And isn't this a step too far? And it becomes some say, a near-death experience for NATO. The Secretary General of the Alliance at the time, Lord Robertson of Britain, is aware of all this, and he manages brilliantly to keep the alliance together at a very, very difficult moment. But he also knows that this cannot go on. And in February of 2003, right before the Iraq war begins, he comes to a visit in the Oval Office. Lord Robertson at one point says, may I be frank with you, Mr. President? And catching everyone's attention, of course. And then he starts criticizing the president. And as he recalled in an interview I had with Lord Robertson, the room turned very cold and frosty silence. But he told the president that this posture he had, the way he spoke about war on terror and how to either they were with us or they were with the terrorists, and how he would do so in a bomber jacket and just look tough. That spoke well to an American public, but it didn't speak well to a NATO public. And Lord Robertson recalls how Bush himself, he gracefully accepted this criticism and broke the ice and said, does that mean that I'm as disliked in Europe as him? And he pointed to Donald Rumsfeld, and everyone started laughing. NATO was in the process of becoming too lopsided, too American, too global, too disconnected from what it was really about, namely the Atlantic peace and keeping threats out of Europe or the Euro-Atlantic area. And this has definitely become almost a breaking point for NATO.
That's Professor Stan Renning, author of NATO from Cold War to Ukraine. Next, a story of migration and one of the events from the past which has had a direct impact on the creation of multicultural societies. Pakistan had been an independent, mainly Muslim state for 20 years when, in 1967, a construction project caused a massive upheaval. That was when the Mangla Dam was built in Mirpur. It provoked a huge global migration, with whole communities forced to leave their homes. Many of them came to Britain. Riaz Begum was one of those who left Mirpur for London. She's been speaking to Ben Henderson.
We're still connected to that land deeply. I still dream of that land. It feels like I'm wandering those houses, those streets, in almost like a parallel dimension. It still exists in my mind and my soul. We had one big structure made from stone and mud, and we'd all sleep in that room together. And we'd fall asleep telling each other stories about past kings and queens and princes and princesses.
Mirpur became part of Pakistan when India was partitioned into India and Pakistan in 1947. The region lacked a reliable water source, so Pakistan's government came up with a technological solution, as reported by Associated Press in 1967.
Water, the lifeblood of all humanity. And in Pakistan, the new Mangla Dam. To build it, probably the largest amount of equipment ever used on one project. One of the largest in the world, the dam will give Pakistan a source of water independent from India.
The dam was built to trap water from the Jhelum River and use it to irrigate the land. Riaz's family were farmers living in a valley nearby. When the dam's construction began, their mountain views were replaced by huge concrete walls, and they discovered, to their horror, that their valley would be used as a reservoir for the water.
When we eventually saw the waters coming, we didn't know how to deal with it. We were absolutely terrified. Once the waters had risen, it was the new landscape that we struggled to adapt to. People started to travel via boat. No one really knew how to swim. When people had weddings and they'd need to cross the water, there were so many instances where whole families, they'd go by boat and they'd fill it too much and they'd all end up dying because they didn't know how to swim.
And this obviously happened over a period of years. When was the moment you realised you had to leave?
We didn't want to leave initially. The night before we left, we had one small shelter left, one small little hut. 2 people slept per bed, and we had one cow, and we had her in the shelter with us overnight. In the morning, the water came about 10 meters away from where our homes were. Then the 4 of us and our cow, we then walked to our new home.
80,000 people had to be evacuated some were given cash compensation, and all were rehoused. Gradually, the old villages disappeared, victims of the tides of progress.
I've been listening to a few reports from the time, and they were suggesting that everyone should have been compensated. Did you receive any form of compensation?
They gave us some money. It was about 1,000 rupees, which even at that time was really nothing. We never felt that we were duly compensated.
This boy, like thousands of other Pakistanis in Britain, left Mirpur in Kashmir, and there's a special reason. The Mangla Dam in Mirpur is one of Pakistan's showpieces. The 7 miles of dam were completed last year, bringing vast benefits. But 70,000 acres of land were flooded, and over 80,000 people were dislodged from their homes. There was resettlement and compensation, of course, but beneath the waters of this lake disappeared a 400-years-old town. Many people were landless, yet now had some money to try the trek to jobs in Britain.
The dam wasn't the only reason Mirpuris ended up in Britain. They first migrated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Britain still ruled India. Many worked on Royal Navy ships. More followed when Britain needed workers to rebuild after the Second World War. These waves meant Mirpuris had family members in the UK. British law allowed immigration from Commonwealth countries on the grounds of reunifying families. So, when their homes and fields were destroyed by the water diverted by the dam, tens of thousands left for Britain, as you heard in that clip from 1969. Riaz's husband already worked in Britain. She joined him there in 1972, aged 21.
When I came to the UK, I found it really hard. Not knowing the language was quite a big thing. There was one time when I'd invited some people over for food and I needed yogurt, but I didn't know how to say yogurt in English. So I went to one of the other ladies who I knew who'd been here for a bit longer. I said to her, what do they call yogurt in English? She said, I think they call it milk butter. So in those times you had the milkman and he'd have the local groceries. So the next morning I went to him and I said, can I have milk butter? He just looked at me completely confused, like, what's milk butter? So he pulls out some bread and I say, no, not bread. He goes back and he pulls out some eggs and I say, no, not this. So he's like, what is it that you want? What is this milk butter? So I go back in my house and I rummage around and I am trying to look for old cartons of yogurt. And I took it to him and I said, this is what I'm looking for. And he said, gosh, that's yogurt. That's what it is. It's not milk butter, it's yogurt. And I just found that both hilarious but also really sad at the same time, because that basic language wasn't there to help me live my life. But I got my yogurt in the end.
Today, 60 to 70% of Britain's entire Pakistani community descend from Mirpur and its surrounding region. That's roughly 1 million people, and the culture flows both ways. Mirpur is nicknamed Little England.
Over the years, more people have come over, and we've got family across the whole country, so there's a real strong sense of community, and it's really lovely, and I'm happy.
A few years ago, you went back to your old village. Could you tell me about your memories of returning and what it meant to you?
Yeah, I took my daughter to the land, and when it's the low tide, the water recedes and we get to go back to where our homes were. We see the foundations, they're still there. We see some of the gravestones as well. We found these perfectly rounded shaped rocks, and we realised that we had originally used them as scales, so each one should roughly be about 1 kg. My brother took one, and I gave my one to my daughter. I'm holding it now in my hand. It's almost a perfect circle. It's like a disc. For me, I fell in love with this stone. It's a symbol of all the people who have touched it, who have worked with it over time. And I don't know how many generations would have used this stone. And in a way, it represents the connection
connection with our ancestors, and I'm suddenly taken back to that place.
As you said,
even though the origins of the dam were violent and disruptive, I think over time we are healing slowly.
Inshallah, मैं जिंदगी रही तो मैं बात जानते.
Riaz Begum was speaking to Ben Henderson and recalling how the building of a dam in Pakistan in 1967 has had a direct impact on Britain. There's more coming up in just a moment when the History Hour returns.
This is the BBC World Service, looking into Oregon's radical drug decriminalisation policy.
For the past 3 years, Oregon has wrestled with the country's boldest ever attempt at undoing the war on drugs through a groundbreaking new law, Measure 110.
The state's new drug decriminalization law turns possessing small amounts of street drugs into a violation, like a traffic ticket.
I've been speaking to lawmakers and people who work and live on the streets at the coalface of the state's drug crisis.
There's been a 1,500% increase in fentanyl overdose deaths.
The state was painfully ill-equipped to handle this new surge.
Fentanyl is more addictive, more lethal, and cheaper than any drug. We have significant challenges ahead of us.
A reckoning with drugs in Oregon at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Coming up in part 2 of the History Hour, 30 years on, we'll be remembering the Rwandan genocide with a survivor who's shown a remarkable capacity for forgiveness. Dr. Heimlich's daughter on her father's life-saving legacy, and seaside sniggering, the opening of Britain's first nudist beach.
About a quarter of an hour ago, the council workmen arrived and put up a sign which says, "Official Naturist Beach. Beyond this notice, clothing need not be worn for bathing, sunbathing or other recreation."
First, a news summary.
BBC News with Emily Thomas. Israeli troops have pulled out of Gaza's biggest hospital, Al-Shifa, after a 2-week operation which caused widespread destruction. The IDF says it killed around 200 militants. It insists the operation prevented harm to civilians, patients and staff. Israeli police have arrested a sister of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. The woman will appear in court later on Monday. Turkey's main opposition party says it defied biased media coverage to win local elections on Sunday. The CHP's Secretary-General said her colleagues were given only a few seconds on the national broadcaster, while the governing AK party had hours. Official figures from China suggest the world's second-largest economy is showing tentative signs of recovery. The National Statistics Bureau says factory output is slightly up for the first time in 6 months. South Korean police are seeking to arrest 2 men for allegedly being part of a plot to install spy cameras in voting booths ahead of this month's parliamentary elections. They're accused of working with a social media influencer who police say has far-right political views. He's already been detained. State media in Russia say a rescue operation to free 13 miners trapped by a landslide has ended after 2 weeks. The Interfax news agency said efforts at the site in the Amur region in the Far East couldn't continue due to the risk of another rock collapse. Beijing says it's urged the Mexican authorities to step up efforts to investigate the deaths of 8 Chinese citizens in a migrant boat disaster. The bodies were found on a beach in the state of Oaxaca on Friday. Cannabis has been legalized in Germany. Those over the age of 18 can now carry 25 grams for personal use and grow 3 marijuana plants at home. The government's trying to tackle black market trade. BBC News.
Welcome back to part 2 of the History Hour with Max Pearson. Still to come, Dr. Heimlich and his manoeuvre, remembered by his daughter, and Daring to Go Naked, Britain's first nudist beach. Before that, on an altogether more sombre theme, we're marking 30 years since the genocide in Rwanda, 100 days of atrocities which shocked the world. It was an inter-ethnic eruption of violence. As part of the Tutsi ethnic group, Antoinette Mutabazi's family found themselves as targets for the killings at the hands of Hutu militias. She's been talking to Rosie Blunt, and a warning that Antoinette's story is distressing from the start.
It's April 1994. Antoinette Mutabazi is 11 years old. She lives in Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda, with her parents and 3 brothers.
My mom used to be a tailor, so she used to sew clothes. My dad used to work with this company that was selling the car spares. As an African Rwandan who have extended families, and we always had a great time with the cousins, and it was great. It was a loving childhood.
Antoinette's family are Tutsi, Rwanda's second largest ethnic group, that ruled the country until 1959, when they were overthrown by the majority group, the Hutus. In 1993, the Rwandan government had signed a peace agreement to end a 3-year civil war with the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF, a rebel group comprised mainly of exiled Tutsis.
The death of President Habyarimana of Rwanda has thrown his country into more chaos.
But on April the 6th, the president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, was assassinated when his plane was shot down.
Including the Prime Minister, to have murdered members of...
He was a Hutu, and although it's still not clear who killed him, his death was the catalyst for the Rwandan genocide.
I didn't hear the news, my dad had the news, and he said, "This is the apocalypse, this is the end, the Hutus are going to kill us." And he gave us, with my brothers, a briefing: don't hide together, because if you hide together, they are going to kill you all at the same time. Try at your best to be alone, so if they kill one, probably another one will survive.
Leading up to the genocide, propaganda had been aired on the radio, inciting violence and labelling Tutsis as cockroaches, or inyenzi.
People came to our house and they were looking for cockroach. And they were looking for what they used to call inyenzi, because the Tutsis were given those words that meant if you see a cockroach, if you see a snake, you have to crush them, you have to basically get anything you could get to bang on their head.
Hutu extremists went on a killing spree, targeting Tutsis and political opponents. Around 800,000 people were slaughtered in the genocide. Neighbours killed neighbours, and some men even murdered their wives. Sexual violence was rampant, and hundreds of thousands of women were raped.
We just ran, and I just was running around and hiding in the bush for 100 days. It's survival mode. I was alone, so I was running for my life. No food, no water. I was digging the sweet potatoes from the field. I was just, trying to see if no one sees me, and moving from one place to another, walking, wearing one clothes, getting dry, and after rain, and that was it. So it was survival mode. I was going around the bush and hiding, kind of going around the circles actually in the town where we were. The day I saw my brother, who was 6 years old then, he had a grenade fallen into his head. He was grasping his last breath when he was saying, "I need water." And being not able to provide for water or to give him what he was asking for was one of the difficult, I don't even know the vocabulary to use, was harrowing to see. He was dying and I couldn't give him water, and he died there in my hands, and I had to abandon him to go and hide. I saw my brother when he was taking his last breath.
Antoinette's youngest brother was also killed.
My brother, who was 2 years old, was murdered together with the other 50 children in the village that were they were burnt to death.
One day, Antoinette was caught and lined up to be executed.
They said, "This is another cockroach, so come." So I joined the queue, but I could see they were killing, so people kept chopping people's head off. If you had money, they would shoot you. If you didn't, they will cut your head off. And there was only 2 people ahead of me when someone shouted that the bank in Kigali is being broken into. So they ran to go and get money from the bank, and that's how I survived that day. And I just sneaked back into the bush and closer by. Sitting in that bush that evening, I could see the body of our people being fed to these dogs. I remember seeing these dogs, some of them with hands or a piece of human being. I was devastated and terrified.
Eventually, the RPF joined forces with the Ugandan army and invaded Kigali, bringing the genocide to an end.
Kigali falls to the RPF after weeks of shelling.
Human rights groups say RPF fighters killed thousands of Hutu civilians as they took power, a claim the RPF denies.
So these soldiers, and they are tall, they are loving, and one of the guy I met said the Kinyarwanda word humura, which it's not only you are okay, it spoke volume, because seeing a soldier and is welcoming you and saying you are fine. But that's the day of the official end of the genocide, and then we had to pick up the pieces.
Today, in an age when disinformation and conspiracy theories are rife, some deny the Rwandan genocide ever happened.
One person said to have survived the genocide against Tutsi is a responsibility. So it's my duty to speak, to tell the world that these things happen. As someone who lived through that, if you see those things that are denying what you lived through, it just can't work. It's hard to share the story. It needs to be shared because we are alive. And no one should say it didn't happen, because that's not right. That's injustice.
I asked Antoinette how she moved on from experiencing such extreme trauma at such a young age.
Forgiveness is a gift that you receive, and forgiveness is the gift that you give to someone else that has offended you. But it's also a choice that you make. So I will say this, the forgiveness that I give to people who murdered my family members, it was a great investment for my well-being.